I'm Corinne. I'm going to be chairing the session from Bristol University and also from Babette University. I have an association with that. I'm going to be talking with all the colleagues here about two parallel projects that have been undertaken in the UK and South Africa.
Could you move the microphone to the online audience? Yeah,
is that better?
Yeah.
This one. Okay. Okay, thanks. So we've undertaken two projects in South Africa and the UK to look at racial divisions in wealth in those countries. And that's been a project engaged in by researchers in community groups and advocacy and activist groups alongside the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit at UCT and the International Inequalities Institute at LSE. So in terms of the South African case, but also this is not so untrue of the UK, I guess, wealth is obviously, from the World Bank's recent report and many other documents, much more unequal than income, and yet quite often harder to track than income. So you can see here in terms of Southern Africa, on the left, you can see from the two, for each country here, Botswana, Namibia and South Africa, you can see the distribution of income being less unequal than the distribution of wealth. And in the left, in the column at the top, is the amount that the top 10% of people earn, or in the second column, for each country, the amount at the top in black, dark blue, black I think, is the amount of wealth that the top 10% of people earn. So that you can see that wealth is significantly more concentrated than income in these graphs. And then on the right, you can see, according to World Bank estimates, one would have to say, that in this unequal distribution of wealth and income, actually, race plays a large part, and in fact, the largest part, and that part has increased over the 10 years from 2008 to 2018. But at the same time, there are not really consistent evidence, there's not that much consistent evidence around racial wealth divides in South Africa, or indeed in the UK. My colleague Babette is going to talk about the situation in the UK and the studies that are being done there. And we're going to, I'm just going to share here some contributions from South African researcher colleagues. So overall, the study that we've been doing in South Africa, or various people have been doing in South Africa, has actually taken on a number of different projects. So there's been a kind of theoretical study to look at how wealth has been defined, and also empirically to look at what kind of data exist around wealth and racial divides in South Africa. Then there's been a new analysis of the National Income Dynamics Survey, looking at different forms of capital and how those are racially distinguished in South Africa, divided in unequal ways. There's another study that's looking at estates data, that is how much people leave, so generational wealth, and looking at how that is racially distinguished, divided, in fact. And then there's also a survey study by Annalena Oppel, who unfortunately can't be here, although she's listed on the program, which shows that absolute rather than relative expressions of wealth are the ones that generate the strongest perceptions of unfairness, attitudes that indicate inequality ought to be tackled in a quite large survey study. And then there's the work that colleagues here are going to talk about now, which is focus group research with various stakeholders in South Africa about the nature of wealth and how it is racially divided in South Africa and what remedies there might be. And this work is being done not really to hear the voice of people, but actually to treat the participants in these studies as policy formers and as theorists, not as we heard in some of the sessions before, simply to kind of listen and ignore. So I'm going to proceed just to briefly show you some of the outcomings of this kind of study. There's a quote at the beginning from one of the participants from the Movement for Change and Social Justice, describing the intersections of race, coloniality, and climate change. This was a overall has involved about 15 focus groups with very complex descriptions and accounts of wealth coming out of those groups, quite well theorized very often by the participants, with wealth quite differently understood in many ways, but also there being quite clear distinctions between being poor, having money, and actually being wealthy. So having disposable income is not the same. Most people would have said, I think, in these groups, having disposable income is not the same as having wealth. And most of the, all of the groups and many of the participants made really strong connections between racial and class wealth, and also between histories of colonialism and apartheid and current state of wealth in South Africa. So they were also very, very intent on describing structures of generational wealth. I think probably more than that would have been done in the UK. I'm not sure about that, but it was very standardly raised in the South African study. And that wealth was very, very comprehensively described, I would say, in terms of spanning debt, documents, citizenship documents, and then more obvious things like goods that you might own, property and land that you might own. And some of the colleagues are going to examine some specific examples of wealth in what follows. And there was one of those studies involved African national migrants in South Africa, and how that large proportion of the South African population relates to wealth and the racial divide of wealth in South Africa. And there was consistent links drawn between environmental emergency and wealth divides. And also many suggestions made for how to deal with these issues, from quite small-scale policy suggestions, quite specific and probably doable policy suggestions, up to really large structural kinds of changes that were advocated. And at the same time, there was a quite strong sense in many of the focus groups that quite little could be done because, as this heading says, money makes money, and the intransigence of structures of wealth was very well recognized, I would say. So that's a very brief overview, but I'm going to hand over for contributions to the following, although I think, in fact, there is one speaker from MCSJ at the moment here. So perhaps we could just welcome first Michael HAMNCA, who's going to speak about the study that MCSJ, the Movement for Change and Social Justice, has done on this. Thanks, Michael.
Good day, everyone. My name is Michael HAMNCA from the MCSJ, Movement for Change and Social Justice Coalition. And we work with Kailicha and Guguletu, where we have a group of people in a certain community. We call them the chapter of plus minus 15 people, to have these wealth gap discussions. What our two discussions that we have taken upon actually to deal with, it was about housing and about the land. Now, what I will do, I will speak first about the housing issue, because why still this? We don't have adequate houses in our society. And it's a big problem because we are sitting with the government for 30 years and still black people don't find them in good houses, of have ownership of the same house, because they don't have even title deeds of the houses where they stay. So government still own those houses. You don't have a house. They have borrowed that house to you, with other words. And the other thing is the housing that you are getting, you don't have a space actual to do other things, like to plant, to sit, take seats and do vegetables in your yard actual, so you cannot go and buy. Then you sit with housing again, because you can't extend your house because you have maybe a one room house, a shack with no windows. That is why we have a lot of outcomes in those houses, because of tuberculosis that are happening in those houses. You can go and treat it but you will be infecting some other people because there's not a quality house for human being. Again, when we talk about those houses, we find out I don't see government actually will do good, because that is why we have discussions. How can we as communities break these inequalities and the social justice that is happening in our society? So what we have done now is, because we have started doing engagements about, does we have the right leadership in positions to run these governments? Because for 30 years, they don't deliver. And again, to answer your question, this leadership said all these black people must accept it's a norm. It's how they must live. And when we look at what is the problems around this, is more corruption. And some structures that they have put in to do corruption, the BEE, it does not work because it does not even create decent jobs. It's more unemployment in youth, more unemployment in graduates. So that is why we feel so hard, because how can we remove this government? It's the only way is to have an independent candidates now that will sign a pledge actually to make, so we can get rid of the inequality. When it comes to land is a big issue, because it seems we don't deserve land, our own land. Why? Because 1994, it was supposed with the reform of land, but it did not happen. Now we sit in 30 years' time with land that belongs to Henry Verwoerd in our country. That was put in a trust, a Bantu trust in Transkei government. That we don't know who are the people who are sitting in that trust 30 years down the line. It seems our government has failed us because we'll never get land. We have applied for land actually to be, if they can't give land, let them pay out the people. 1998, submissions was done. Till now, there's no money that have come forward. So it means black people don't know about money, they don't know about land in 30 years' time. So government have failed them. Now you ask your question again, because all these people who are doing disputes is people with money, people who have power, and we don't have power because we can't afford for lawyers to do these litigations against government, or to do these litigations against these people who own these lands. And again, because if they try to do amendment on Section 25 of the Constitution, they have failed again, government. Because there's a provision in the Constitution, Section 25, subsection 6, where they said they can give land. Government is obliged actually to give you land. There was not need actually for them to amend the Constitution, because I don't know how does they read the Constitution, because subsection 6, 25, Section 25, subsection 6 tells government how can you give land, reform land to people, ordinary citizens. So there's the issues that we are sitting with, because there's a lot of land that is available, are sitting in different trusts. There's a MA trust that is in KZN. There's a one in Mpumalanga trust. All those lands, we can't get the hold of it because of lands goes to people who are elites, people who are in government. So it means poor people will stay poor. It's up to us as an organization, the change for movement actually, to demonstrate this in our communities, to conscientize our communities, to make sure our communities understand what is the right actually, how to challenge government, and how to demonstrate this in our communities. Thanks.
now have Faeza MEYER, who's coming from the African Water Commons Collective, to speak to us about the work that she has been doing with the research work that's now.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Faeza MEYER. I'm from the African Water Commons Collective. The African Water Commons Collective is an organization, or not an organization, it's a collective of activists that are currently working together to deep dive into local communities, into the issues around water. And there are many. And so I have done 3 different workshops, not workshops, 3 different focus groups and 1 workshop. So the 3 different focus groups was specifically done with specific intentions. So the one was with youth, because they are our future, and they need to understand what the struggles are and how to be able to go forward with it. Then with women, because women are the ones who face the brunt when there are no services, etc., being provided, and they're also the ones willing to fight. And then with pensioners, because they are the targets in our communities. That is what we've noticed, that the government targets older people because they are unable to defend themselves. And so in all 3 of this workshop, in focus groups, we've discovered different things. Like the young people, as an example, and all of them were unemployed. We actually tried to get youth that were employed and some unemployed so that we can get a different view. But we found that most of the youth in the area was unemployed, and they were the ones who were interested in the focus group. And they were really stuck. You know, there was a lot of negativity coming out, like they were really stuck in a situation where some of them have got matric, some of them have done some studies and courses, but they are at home, they are unemployed, they don't have jobs, and so there's a very negative understanding of the future for them. Then there's the women. The women, it was very sad. There was lots of crying in the focus group, because I think it was there where women saw, you know, the bigger picture of why we sit in situations where we don't have food on our tables. You know, we have to connect the dots. And the racial divide has got a lot to do with why poor people don't have food often to give their children, or even something as basic as water. And then with the pensioners, also very sad that because of apartheid, a lot of pensioners in our area, including my parents, were not educated. You know, apartheid allowed us only to go to a certain point of education, and also our parents were poor, and so they ended up working at a young age. And so, unfortunately and very sadly, our government tends to target these old people, like getting them to sign documents they don't understand the language, you know, the policies and the things they want to implement. They paint a beautiful picture of how wonderful it is. You know, the devices they give, as an example, the water management device came with a lot of promises, and then people were disappointed because none of the promises were true, and now they sit in deep trouble and deep debt. Then we had a workshop, a bigger workshop, a general workshop, and deliberately made sure that there was activists and not activists, you know, ordinary people who's not been active, to get a better sense of, you know, a deep dive into. And this time around, the workshop was around how do we use the racial wealth divide and the research questions to dive deeper into our own issues. So the issues in our communities at the moment, or what the African Water Commons Collective is fighting against, is the water management devices that the City of Cape Town is installing at the moment, that literally has water dripping out of people's taps, that critical decisions people are making on whether they should wash their kids, whether they should cook, you know, all of these critical decisions. We had a pensioner, as an example, that's scraping ice out of the freezer so that she can take a chronic medication. That's how bad it is. And so it was important for us to deep dive into a better understanding of what people are thinking around the racial wealth divide in South Africa. And people were saying, there was the activists, and it was clear the groups before that was all activists, and they had a different view. They were very critical, they were very radical about, and we should do something about this divide. But then there's a different group of people who weren't organized and active, and they were thinking it's normal. You know, people were thinking that where we're at, it's normal. Some of it was even religiously based, you know, like God loves the poor. These are the kind of things. And it was saddening because we know for a fact that capitalism is the problem. You know, that neoliberal capitalism is what is really killing us. You know, it's It's taking away the basic services. I mean, the other day we heard on the news, the president saying, oh, we have to get more police. But if we look at the GDP, the policing budget is growing and the service delivery is becoming smaller. And what's even worse is in our communities now on the Cape Flats, our government has taken a very healthy, radical women's group called the Walking Bus that just take kids to school. You know, it's just a normal group of women. They've taken this group because it's grown so strong and disbanded the group. And they've employed all these women. And you know what they're going to do? They are going to protect service providers. So when I, in my community, say no to the device, it's the women in the community that's going to fight against me. So this research has been extremely important for us as an organization and for the water action committees across the city that we work with, because it gives people a bigger picture sense of why we are in these situations. We begin to look at class, we begin to look at race, we begin to look at all of these things holistically. And it's like I've heard in many presentations today, you cannot separate the one from the other. Electricity, the same thing that's happening to water at the moment, happened to electricity a few years ago. We got electricity boxes, and these boxes, you press, you buy, and you punch in, and then you get electricity. So if you don't have electricity, it's only you switching yourself off, right? We've got nobody else to blame. And so we start blaming ourselves. Back in the day, we used to go to the municipality and say, I can't afford it. I have a son that has asthma at home, and he needs a nebulizer. And they would say, okay, you pay it off. Now my son has asthma, I can't speak to the box. There's no relationship there. And the same thing is happening with the water management devices that they are installing in the city now. Old people have little bits of water dripping out of their tap, making critical decisions, walking long distance. They have a bill, they buy electricity, still gets deducted, but there's no water coming from the taps. So really, if anything, this research is going to help us raise consciousness and help people to stand up and fight for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faeza. I think we should move to Ivan now, who's going to talk about his work with African nationals who are not South African in South Africa. Could you? You're getting your slides? Yeah.
I'm not sure how to work this. Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ivan. I'm from UCT. I'm a migrant who is staying in South Africa. Why I find that important to say as a starting point is that I always tell people and refer to the statement that says, show me your research and I'll show you an autobiography. And as a researcher, I would like to define myself as a migrant researcher. The experiences of migration to South Africa and within Africa have been very personal to me as an individual, but also in understanding migration within Africa as well. Part of the shocking aspects that I've seen in research has been that not only is migration in research looked at from a point of view where African migrants are viewed to be migrating more to the global north, so to speak, but the reality within literature and within statistics has shown that migration within the global south actually happens there, and specifically within SADC, right? And the economic economic standing of South Africa has allowed it to take in a lot more migrants that are coming from other African countries. And the dynamics of the relationships within that has allowed a space where research should continue to understand these experiences, and this is why I also find this research quite imperative and important. So part of what the paper that I'm working on looks at is the aspect of framing the migrant other and the foreign other through the lens of wealth divides within South Africa. So doing this job of othering and the colloquial those people, so to speak, who are mostly African migrants within South Africa. So Within this bigger project, we hosted focus groups, and from those focus groups, we had focus groups that were specifically focused on migrants who are in South Africa. And part of why this conversation is important specifically for this conference is also because of the fact that most of the migrants that come to South Africa, specifically African migrants who relocate to South Africa or make an effort to relocate to South Africa, are motivated, either pushed by economic hardship or pulled to South Africa by potential economic prosperity that is within South Africa. And you can imagine, one speaker was talking in the previous session that I attended about how South Africa, specifically in the informal sector, is structured to show barriers of entry within that segment. And you can imagine another layer of migrants coming into that space and the experiences that they find within that space, even if they are formal migrants, so to speak, or the greater bulk who are undocumented, so to speak, right? So just going to show excerpts of some of the data that we took from the research before going into the aspects of some of the findings that we had. So this is Calvin, one of the participants. Obviously, the names are pseudonyms to protect the confidentiality of the participants, who stated that if you're a foreigner in South Africa, you are kept on the other side of the fence. You are not even a spectator. At least a spectator can see what is happening in the field. You cannot even participate in the creation of wealth. You are excluded. I never knew I was black until I came to South Africa. I used to think I was just me, but I never knew that I was black until I came here and saw, so I am actually black. It is only black foreigners who are excluded. You can't be white and be excluded. Have you ever seen South Africans when they say foreigners? Have you ever seen white people being included in the bracket of foreigners? I don't think so, right? So what Calvin was trying to express here is the assertion that is this assertion of black on black otherness, right? Where the journey of racialization, or the connotations that are used within racializing other people, is now being mobilized by black people as well, to black people who come to South Africa. And there's this rhetoric of people who are coming from the West finding it easy not only to access South Africa, but also finding it easy to be welcome to South Africa, you know. But if someone is coming from the global south, specifically if they're coming from the African countries, it is harder to access South Africa, but also harder to navigate South African spaces, because you're always seen as the other, or the unwanted other, who is described as a foreigner rather than a migrant who is described as a tourist or an expat or someone who deserves the red carpet to be rolled out to be in South Africa. So this nationality, and both on account of being South African and not being South African, but specifically being African, is mobilized differently in South African social and political spaces. And specifically, like I stated before, migrant is used and reserved for people who are coming from the West, and specifically the global North, whereas foreigners is mobilized when someone is coming from the global South. And specifically, the darker the skin, the less welcome that someone is within South African spaces. And more poignant to note is the fact that mostly by Black South Africans and within Black spaces as well. So both have access to wealth, but varying levels of accessing wealth and being wealthy in that regard. One of the participants, Tino, also stated that, well, I think a very few Black people are wealthy here. Here meaning in South Africa. Very few, especially the foreign ones, like from Zimbabwe, from Congo, from Nigeria. Nigerians, some of them, they are wealthy, because I once went to Waterfront in a restaurant. Surprise, surprise. There came guys, wealthy guys. You can see, you're smelling money, and he laughs. You're smelling money. But I asked the other guy, what do you do for a living? And he said, I do IT. Those people, they are robbing people. Those IT guys, they are robbing people, and I think the other thing is the reason why people are getting poorer and poorer is corruption. There's a lot of corruption here. A very few Zimbabwean guys here are wealthy. A very few, I think about 2%. Most wealthy, like white people, like white people, they're a majority of wealthy white people here. Here in Cape Town, especially here in Cape Town. So a very few foreigners, especially black foreigners, are actually wealthy. And we start to see this categorization that starts to happen with wealth, where there is a social and political laden language that stipulates that if you're white, it's actually acceptable for you to be wealthy. Wealth is seen not only as being as having things, but also the race someone imbues also opens gates for them to be wealthy. I was talking to some of the participants after research. Surprisingly, that's where most of the beautiful data happens, and they were talking about how, even specifically for people who are from Zimbabwe, if someone is rich and they are black, right, they start to be called Murungu or Mlungu, right, which means a white person. Which means that you are entering that space of whiteness, and that accumulation of wealth is used as a connotation that also depicts whiteness, or a transition into a higher form of race, so to speak. But also what we've seen in South Africa is that these categories are also driven by the fact that racially laden definitions of wealth have remained the same even post-apartheid. Whiteness still represents and has a maintenance of the social perception of economic prosperity, and this has been stated not only by the participants but also other authors like Ratela who write about this. The history of South Africa also naturalizes the association of whiteness and wealth, and the aversion of blackness to this aspect of wealth, and the narrative that I showed before also shows that way. If someone is wealthy and is black or is successful, there is an ease of criminalizing them than just accepting that they worked hard and actually have these they actually had wealth. You know, we see these connotations of Nigerians being seen as scammers in South Africa, and the moment that a Nigerian has money or is wealthy, those aspects start to come in. So for Africans who migrate to South Africa, there is a lot of language and social discourse that makes them feel like they are the other, who don't belong, both socially and politically, and also in terms of wealth. And what really shows that in terms of wealth and where it's really dominant is how documents and documentation and access to documentation is wealth defined, right? If you come to South Africa through the airport, you get 3 months, no questions asked. If you come to South Africa through the border, you are questioned and you can get 1 month in South Africa, right? So those aspects also already start to show that documentation is easier to maintain or easier to get for people who are coming from the global north. And someone who was rejected, one participant who was rejected in terms of getting documentation, actually affirmed that the lady from Home Affairs, I don't know her, she rejected it, meaning the permit. But in that rejection letter, she wrote, "You do not qualify. Please go back to your country." Right? I just want to stop there for a moment in terms of the aspect of go back to your country, which has been used in terms of not only criminalizing migrants, but also this assertion of this is not your home, you don't belong here, and beginning the questioning of who belongs here, who owns land, and who is welcome within the South African space. I'm not going to continue with that quotation, but also two other participants within the focus groups also stated that white migrants in South Africa are the ones who are wealthy, not black. Maybe it comes with being white people. There was laughter in the background in Chatham, because majority of white people that I've worked with or worked for, they are wealthy, but they are not South African. Maybe they got a South African ID after living here for a very long time, but by birth, maybe they are from Germany, France, or UK. And the other participant, Tatenda, as the earlier stated that, yes, but guys, you know that you can also buy, like, there are people who are buying nationality and things like that. They can afford, so that, only white people can afford that because it is very expensive. So just by being wealthy, you can actually have access to buying property, and that naturalizes your citizenship or your nationality within the South African space, which also increases this gap in terms of dividing people who are from the global South and keeping them to the fringes of society, where there is this contestation of barriers of entry, like in the informal sector that we spoke about before. So the potential of wealth is realized through the ability to access South Africa. So if some of the participants actually spoke about how when you come from another country, just by merely accessing South Africa, people who you left in that country already see you as a person who's wealthy. But the irony of it is that when you are in South Africa, you start a journey where you're trying to access other stratas that show the intersection between race, nationality, identity, womanhood, and even ethnicity that you have to climb within the South African space. So wealth in South Africa is marked by a significant lack of access to migrants and also resources, documentation, which negates African migrants, specifically economic migrants, to the fringes of South African society, both socially and also politically. Nationality is a marker of who can participate within South African wealth. So if you're undocumented, you can't participate in other facets of the South African wealth. But even if you have the documentation, that takes you like 5 years, also drawing back your ability to participate within wealth, and is mobilized to include and also exclude. And wealth reimagined in South Africa through the lens of the South African history, like I spoke about before, and racial divides are also naturalized socially and politically. And the documentation actually cements access and belonging for Western migrants and exclusion for African economic migrants. Easier access provided to Western migrants and access to documentation is also equated to access to wealth, and the reverse becomes true as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ivan. So I think as our final contributor, Pelisa Dlangamanga, is not here, we will move to... She's not here? No. Okay, fine. So we will move to Babette's account of what's been going on in the UK project that's parallel to this. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Right, bear with me while I get to grips with the clicker. Good afternoon. My name is Babette May. I'm an LSE Sociology PhD student, and I think about care and social reproduction through the life stories of Caribbean heritage women who are employed in caring professions. Alongside this, I'm a research assistant on an International Inequalities Institute project about the racial wealth divides, and these two things are very connected. The Racial Wealth Divides project is a pilot project initially exploring British people's perspectives on the racial wealth divide in the UK. I've been really struck hearing the other speakers on, in many ways, South Africa and the UK are incredibly different, but also the way inequality exists between racialized groups is very similar and has similar origins. So I'm going to look at that with you today. So it's going to be a short and sweet presentation on perceptions. So first, let's think a little on this quote. Looking at the immediacies of the colonial context, it is clear that what divides the world is first and foremost what species, what race one belongs to. In the colonies, the economic infrastructure is also a superstructure. The cause is effect. You are rich because you are white because you are rich. That's Fanon. So in what ways does this statement from the early 1960s relate to UK realities in 2023? The Runnymede Trust Colour of Money report emphasises stark racial divides in wealth assets in the UK. It shows here that Black, African and Bangladeshi households have 10 times less wealth than white British people. As wealth inequality intensifies in the context of asset price inflation, we can expect these racial wealth divides to grow. The racial wealth divide is attracting growing interest, but it's still largely invisible in the public and political debate. In the UK, there is a greater focus on income inequality, but as we can see from the table showing median weekly household income by ethnic group, although there is significant and life-changing income inequality in the UK, the racial wealth divide is even more stark. The racial wealth divide is a complex issue. Eleni Karaganaki's work demonstrates that experiences of entrenched debt at the lower end of the wealth distribution are shared across racialized groups. In the middle of the wealth distribution, only whites and Indians have significant wealth resources. At the top of the distribution, there are major differences in wealth between racialized groups. The racial wealth divide in the UK is an historical and global process. Factors include the British Empire and the consequences of colonialism, enslavement, and ongoing post-colonial extraction for citizens and ex-colonies, the economic consequences of the above as a push factor for economic migrations from the post-colony to the UK, immigration controls. Who does the state admit? From where and for what purposes? Enduring patterns of labour market discrimination influencing wealth acquisition. On this, a meta-analysis of field experiments on racial discrimination in the British labour market from 1969 to 2017 by Heath and D'Estasio suggested an enduring pattern of modest discrimination against white minorities of European heritage, in contrast to much greater risks of discrimination faced by the main non-white groups, suggesting a strong racial component to discrimination. It found the Black Caribbean, Black African, and Pakistani groups all face substantial and very similar risks of discrimination. They found no significant reduction in risks of discrimination over time, so that's over time 1969 to 2017, either for Caribbeans or for South Asians as a whole. As we know, income affects ability to build wealth. Another important factor is inheritance, which for many facilitates access to the property market. But how widely are these factors perceived by different groups in Britain? And so something that I wanted to add that connects to what we've been talking about before is that what we can see from all this is the base level is inequality. So sometimes we do the sort of policies and structures are assuming that we're all starting at the same point, but history and the present, it shows us that we're not starting from the same point, and all of these factors play into that. We worked with the Young Foundation to support peer researchers in delivering focus groups in their respective communities. Focus groups took place online and participants were compensated for their time. We used the same topic guide with each group. I'm going to give you a short overview of some of the perspectives from these groups. So the Black group was made up of women and non-binary people from an organization. They worked with an organization called ADHD Babes. The participants understood the presence of the racial wealth divide, even if they had not named it in those terms, and they directly related the wealth divide to colonial histories. There was an understanding that although the lives of their parents, grandparents, and beyond no, let me start that bit again. There was an understanding that although through the lives of their parents, grandparents and beyond, some of them had become middle class in terms of their education and their profession, they were not middle class at all in terms of their wealth. Wealth was frequently described as something beyond the financial in terms of positive relationships and feeling safe and secure, having peace, access to nature, opportunity, being comfortable and content, and ownership of your time. There was understanding that in our society, many of these things are more attainable if you have financial wealth. Being exposed to new experiences and possibilities was noted to have led some participants to think more about the benefits of financial wealth. Class, gender and race, alongside hard work and luck, were understood as factors to gaining wealth. Home ownership was repeatedly linked to inheritance in terms of the ability to acquire property and the ability to pass on wealth. Not having this leverage was related to living lives that were just about surviving, managing, or getting by. Reflections of the Somali group were very similar. It was expressed that you must be extraordinary to build wealth as a racialized person. They raised the concept that I think you have in South Africa of a black or brown tax. They raised collective responsibility and supporting family members as community building, but it's also something that sort of influences your financial stability. They expressed concerns regarding the impacts of inaccessibility to social capital in fostering financial literacy, enhancing career development, expanding education opportunities for social mobility. For the Indian community, wealth was conceived as tangible assets as well as social capital. The participants discussed extensively the role of empire in perpetuating racial and wealth inequalities in the present day. However, there was low acknowledgement of the role played by social markers such as caste or religion in determining one's ability to acquire wealth in the UK. For the white community, participants were much more challenging to acquire. Overwhelmingly, they were women and non-binary people, and mostly under 40 and in junior positions in their career. The group were politically aware, progressive, and comfortable on policy questions, but less comfortable discussing their own personal experience. Wealth was primarily discussed through home ownership and the politics of who gets family help with home ownership. There was a high awareness of social capital and of intergenerational transmission of financial literacy as a form of wealth. Aspects of white wealth, like investments, were not discussed. I think what this all shows is that ordinary people who are not academics know exactly the same stuff that academics know. On this topic, we're all aware because not only do we have the data, and we've always had the data, we've had the data a long time, but we have eyes. You can just look around you. So in the UK, often these things are structurally questioned by the government, by the media, but we all know, really. So I feel that the elephant in the room is why the real change, what isn't happening. And that perhaps returns us to money makes money. And I think that the thing that we're not talking about is leadership and business, because we're all reliant on businesses in terms of employing us, in terms of pay. We're relying on our governments in terms of just creating those structures. For women in the UK, childcare is an absolutely massive issue. You know, for example, I have a friend with twins and a 5-year-old. She worked out it's going to cost her £36,000 a year to put her children in education if she goes to school, if she wants to go back to work full time. But probably she has the potential to earn maybe 42, 45,000. So you see that, UK incomes, especially London incomes, might be a lot more, but the cost is extreme. And the way you bear this cost is racialized and gendered and affected by disability and all of those other things. Yeah, so that's me laying out all the problems with no solutions for you. So our next steps are that we plan to bring the UK and the South Africa research on racial wealth divides together in the form of an open access publication. So please watch this space for that. And thank you for listening.
We should probably have everybody up here. Would you like to come up for the question? So maybe we can have some questions from people here, but then we'll also maybe have some discussion between the panel, because this is the first time actually that the UK and South African researchers have been talking together about their work. So yeah, please. Yeah, and then the gentleman there. If you could pass the mics. Yeah, that'd be great.
Oh, you're going to do it. Yeah, no.
So we can keep one up here.
Hi there. I just have a question regarding the water meters that you raised. In terms of water scarcity, what would the ideal solution be, do you feel, to ensure that people on the ground actually have water and that they do feel as if there is a connection between them and the municipality in terms of communicating that need? Thanks.
Thank you. My question is to do with the presentation on foreign people in South Africa and their experience of the wealth divide. I'd just like to know your perspective on the fact that there's also a lot of people from outside South Africa over time that have been able to create a lot of wealth, and perhaps revisiting their initiatives on how they distribute wealth amongst their communities, but more so what kind of urgency can be given to encouraging them to also mobilize policies or lobby for policies that also make it safe and make it possible in creating more integration amongst people that either have wealth or don't have wealth from that perspective, from a migration perspective, essentially.
So maybe we'll take these three and then we can get some answers from the panel.
Hi. I just have some comments about the wealth distributions in South Africa versus England. I'm just looking at some data now, and if you look at the difference between white and black real wages or real income in South Africa, the differential is 20 times. So that's 20,000%, which is a massive difference, and that's at the peaks of the distributions. And what I think is really interesting is that in South Africa, we overlook the Indian race group, but when we consider it a race, so it's North, East, South Asian, so Chinese people, Indian people, Pakistani people, Sri Lankan people, we all in one race group, but we make up 2% of the population, and it's over time, studying that race group has been extremely neglected. But if you look at the data, Indian men follow very closely to white men as the second highest earners in South Africa. So thinking about how Indian people were disadvantaged in apartheid, but they must have benefited somehow to be able to have that level of wealth. And then at the same time, for Ivan's paper, it's interesting to know how Indian immigrants are treated compared to immigrants from other African countries, because it's very obvious that those Indian immigrants also don't have the level of wealth that those kind of diaspora Indian population has. And I think in terms of change, maybe if you can just comment on how the political incentives are not aligned for things like an inheritance tax or more serious wealth taxes. Thank you.
Maybe that last question is for everybody.
Yeah,
in fact.
yeah, sure.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. Should we start with the question about water justice to Faeza? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So the situation with the meters, we've tried to push back. I don't know if you know about the blue top water management device that the city started installing in 2014. And so just recently, in 2018, they came up with a new policy, but it was a lot to do with because we were pushing back. People were saying this device was faulty, and it was. And it didn't give people enough water. You know, it only allowed 350 liters of water to come out of the tap. And the city very well knows that we live in overcrowded conditions, right? We live with extended family because they're not building houses. So we live with extended families. And we used to have backyarders, but now there's front yarders and people on the side and up to 5 structures on one property. So the water was uselessly too little. And so we pushed back from all over the city, and they came up on the 18th of April with a new policy, and this is called the conventional meter. And this meter sounds better than the old one because it gives you more water, but it's actually 10 times worse. Because what they don't tell people is if you sign and you say yes to the conventional meter, they open up your tap and free flow is running. But what they don't say is you're only supposed to use 500 liters of water for the day, which is also still way too little for the amount of people that lives on our properties. And so if you use more than 500 liters for the day, for a month, then they send you after 2 months a warning letter. And most people in Cape Town has already received their warning letters. Then after the 3rd month, if you're still not able to stay below, they then put you on a drip system. And they call it punishment with nothing. They don't care that they call it punishment. So they punish you and they put you on a drip system, 200 liters, which is the free basic, according to the government, that drips out of your tap. And when this, after the 12 months, so for 12 months you have 200 liters of water dripping out of your tap as punishment because you couldn't stay below 500 liters. Then for 12 months, after the 12 months, they give you another try to see if you can stay below. If after that, for another year, you're not able to stay below, here's the trick. The city manager has the sole authority to put you on prepaid. And this is where they ultimately want to go. They want people to buy. And if we must buy, poor people won't survive. So what we are doing, because we don't see, we've been trying to engage with the government on many different levels, and we keep on hitting a rock like a blank wall. There's nothing there. They either straw us along and then eventually tell us that we're not allowed to engage with you anymore. You have to go in and join that focus group or whatever the case may be. So importantly for us is we have to organize ourselves, and that's why we're encouraging people to set up water action committees in different areas. At this moment, there's 15 water action committees that exist in 15 areas across the Western Cape, and people are organizing themselves because we know that even as individual areas, if we say stuff, they don't hear us. So it's important for us to organize ourselves, and there's a campaign for Water for Life that is in the making that we hope to launch soon. And we hope that this campaign with the masses can push back and show government, because water management devices does not work for us. It's never going to work for us. We cannot build relationships with boxes. We need to build relationship with human beings. Thank you.
I'll start by responding to the last question because I think it is into the other question very much well. So there is a paper that I referenced a lot, which actually signifies to me that there has not been a lot of research that has been done specifically on Indians, and specifically on Indians as migrants within South Africa. Now, something that we need to also understand is that a lot of my work specifically has been looking at the experiences of people who are darker-skinned migrants into South Africa. And part of the motivation for that was because of the tension that is within spaces that are of black and black interaction. You know, we have spaces where we see that English is the lingua franca in South Africa. Regardless of the fact that it holds that value, you get into a shop, you buy something, someone speaks to you in that language. someone speaks to you in English, and I'm next in queue, someone speaks to me in Xhosa, with the expectation that my body has to perform a certain way. And then in my body not performing that way that they expect, I am punished immediately, or I am continually forced to speak that language that I cannot speak. Why I'm saying that is that also changes the playing field when it comes to Indian people as well. Because that paper was talking about how Indians settling in South Africa as well were almost seen and established as having an isolated economy, right? I think there is more richer work that needs to be done in that space as well, or I haven't read as much work, but I love that paper because it also talks about how areas like Chatsworth developed as a result of that. Now, it takes me to that question as well, because when people migrate to South Africa, specifically people who migrate for economic reasons, who are the bulk of migrants, most of them are pushed by the fact that they want to share that wealth, or they want to distribute that wealth to other people who they have left behind. And that begins to open up the whole Pandora's box of black tax and what it entails, and the reality of actually being able to afford to pay black tax. So both for Indians and for other people, for Africans specifically who come to South Africa, they talk about this aspect of wanting to distribute this wealth and wanting to share this wealth. They are people who have been able to come to South Africa, specifically before the increase of migration in South Africa, were able to get documents, and in their ability to get documents, they were able to access parts of the economy faster, specifically those who came before independence. And they have been able to not only distribute wealth, but being able to distribute wealth effectively among themselves. Because I really think from what I've seen in research, that aspect of taking care of family and taking care of each other is never lost. Even if you are Indian, even if you are Jew, even if you are African, you always want to distribute that wealth among the people that you want to take care of. Because at the core of it, it's mostly the reason why, even if it's war, you want to get people who were left in that war to distribute that wealth amongst themselves. I honestly haven't really thought about how they can adapt that into policy, and how this group of people that you're asking about can actually debate that into policy. But I think it'll be something that's important to think about as I continue with my work as well. Thank you.
Michael, maybe you could talk about that question. Well, question was asked twice, in fact, about how to do something effective in these areas, because obviously MCSJ has conducted a lot of very effective campaigns. So around different aspects of particularly utility wealth and so on, sanitation and all these kinds of things. I don't know if you could talk a little bit about how you can do that in a way that really has impact.
I think the most important thing is because when we have a community that is very informed because of the issues, because if your community is not informed, you will never demonstrate this with the government, because you can't challenge government. So consultation, to do workshops and trainings for community members actually to understand their rights and how to challenge it. And before you can do either any picket of any protest, the community should be informed, because the reason why is because if you take the community out of the community to face government people, because there's media involved. Now, you can't, if media wants to have an interview with this person, you said, no, you will not talk, because that is why he should be informed about the issues that you will go and ask of the memorandum you will go to give to government. Because if you have done that, you've done that. And again, when you mobilize, you must have masses around communities. Make sure you work with communities very good. Communities understand your struggle, and you have these chapters, these community meetings in every side of the community, so the work can spread out to communities, so you can do your work. Because if you go to that community, you want to do something, you will get the numbers. So it's one of the issues. Again, what we did assist actually, because we feel very bad for immigration. You remember I told you about this. I said the only people who get the residence permits here, it's sports people. They forget about other people who come and assist South Africans actually to make sure they develop their country. Now you ask those questions. What we have done as MCSJ is to take them actually to Home Affairs and apply for permits, because we don't want to see our brothers, our fellow brothers actually being punished for something that the system is failing. As an organization in South Africa, we have taken upon us to assist them actually to get paperwork done, because it was supposed to be done. Because you can hear the guy who was speaking there he said, go back to your country. How can you tell a person go back to your country? You don't know the reasons why is he here in South Africa. You can't do that, because of why they are doing that, because they are too corrupt, because everything they want to sell to people, something that is not sellable actually, that person deserves it. So that is why we are involved also to assist in immigration actually to get paperwork. And the other thing is, when you don't have the will of the government, then we have a problem, because the government is actually a government that is ignoring issues. It's very difficult for community members actually to do things. That is why sometimes you see our protests are not does not give the value that we want to see actually, because people becoming violent, they want to destroy infrastructure. Or our organization, we don't want that. We tell you because we are going to do this in 1, 2, 3, because we put a principle. We don't want violence actually in our protest.
Thank you. On your question that you put to me, I'm not going to speak specifically about South Africa because I'm not South African and I don't know enough about it. But I think that some of the things that I thought through about the UK will sort of cross over, because I think race is a construct that our structures don't deal with very well. So, for example, the way we do it in the UK is we have the Black African tick box and we have the Black Caribbean tick box. And, you know, no matter how many generations down the line you are that you've been here, you might have tick black, it might say Black British / Caribbean, but you're always going to be Caribbean or African. This isn't going to be the same if you're white, because if you migrated from another European country, 2, 3 generations down the line, you're just another white British person. And so the way we measure these things, you know, it doesn't quite work. Also, when you think about Black African, think about all of the different places that you can come from, and then all of the different sort of class and wealth backgrounds that you might have. So it makes these things we lump together. Oh, they're an African. What does it really mean? There's also, I think we have to think about, so for your Indian example, the idea of model minorities versus those that aren't. So there's a lot of US data about the idea of model minorities and who are seen as like the good minorities, and you know, how that works. And then think of, say, you know, because people say things like, oh, well, you know, the Pakistanis do so badly, but the Indians, they do well, so what are they doing right? No. Like, Pakistanis are often Muslim, and Muslims are way more criminalized. Black people are criminalized, and this happens from you start school. And so, and those people experience more school exclusions. This affects who you are, your self-esteem, how well you do at school. All of these things trickle upwards to who you end up being. But we don't connect all of these things together when they're all extremely connected. And then on political incentives for wealth taxes, well, I don't know how that works. In some ways, I think that South Africa is more in with a chance because, well, it's a black majority country, so there is some opportunity there. Whereas in the UK, when you're really much more of a minority, why would people with the wealth to pass on want to have a wealth tax? They want it because it's very difficult to buy a house in the UK for an average person, and that is where your stability lies. So you don't want to take that away from your children, and that's not unreasonable, but that means that there's less political will for it. But because of colonialism and all those histories, some people have way more wealth, and some have minus wealth, and so it then, yeah, our base level is unequal, and it's very difficult for people to sort of get to a place where they're okay, some people.
Thank you. Any more questions at the moment?
I just have a comment. It's so interesting because when you ask South Africans...
Oh, hold on.
Thank you so much. I just have a comment. It's so interesting because when you ask South Africans in surveys about a hypothetical ladder and where they're on in terms of their wealth, and usually they're in the bottom one or first or second rung, and you say, where will you be in 3 years? There's always this 6th, 7th, 8th rung, and implicit in that is this hopefulness that there will be social mobility, and I think that that's really a beautiful thing. That's just my comment, that there's this hopefulness, that there is this ability to transition out of poverty.
Is that good though?
I mean, we just have... I suppose. Yeah.
Well, it just means that, like, is that part of what stops us doing something? Because we always think it's going to get better, but we can see from the past few years, it's just getting worse. So, you know, I think we have to be more realistic.
No, okay, no, you can go. I can go after you. Okay. No, I think it's important of what you raise now in terms of that hope that there's change. But I think we need to grapple with how is that going to take place, you know, and who is going to bring about that change. And I think it's very important because what I've heard within all of these sessions, there's a reference made to lower class income, whereas the train of thought I come from, it's the working class, you know, and my understanding of how society is structured, you know, the working class, those 1%ers up on top that owns everything and that. And what I've also heard within the sessions here is about I think, maybe I might be understanding it wrong, it's how do we influence policy? You know, and I think, for me, it's another question. Do we really think we're going to bring about change through policy? Because I'm sure you're some government people here today. So, government is not interested in that kind of change. They have taken their side. They are on the side of business and big business and rich people. It's clear. Marikana 2016 in South Africa, it was clear. Ramaphosa, the ANC, they're taking the side of the bosses. They are going to kill the working class. Faeza has just made mention now that the policing budget has increased. That is only because if you people want to stand up against us, we have the police ready for you. We are going to shoot at you. So what I want to encourage and say to people is that we need to get organized within our areas. And when we speak for us as the African Water Commons Collective, we speak about self-organization. People need to understand themselves why the issues exist and how do we fight ourselves out of these issues. And also, very importantly, for who does this issue exist? Like within this conference, it's the lower income. For me, it's the working class. Where does it come from? How is it implemented that we suffer the way we suffer? So we can either accept that, because the new hope is this relationship that we're supposed to have with government. Where I come from, we need to destroy government and have our own government. What we need now is alternatives. What is the alternatives? How are we going to move forward? What are we fighting for? Because the comrade mentioned there that what they are saying is, what we want is independent candidates. Are we going to win this fight through electoral politics? Are we going to? Where I come from, it's revolution. Thank you.
I just wanted to preempt on the danger of that hope. Why I think that hope is so dangerous is because in the last talk they were talking about how we are moving towards this phase where structural change has been initiated, and you start to ask questions like the data that you're providing proves that there is hope for change, but is there when they are still ranking themselves at that level? Why I think that that hope is dangerous is because it only manifests, or it only highlights how we are at the same place, how the demarcations that existed during apartheid still exist, how the people who were tagged as terrorists and dangerous are still terrorists and dangerous, because even the black people who are moving into mobility is there. I will never deny it, and research has shown that mobility exists. But we also seen the growth of gated communities. The same black people who are moving into those spaces that previously were not accessible to black people or even colored people, what are they doing? They are fencing themselves. And the question becomes, who are they fencing themselves from? And it shows the image of that place where they left. It's still the same. Everything is still the same. And that part is still shaped. And that hope has been there since even forever. And that's my fear.
Hi, just throwing on your point and also some of the points that were raised. In terms of social mobilization and getting people on board in the actual community to make their voices heard. Speaking from personal experience, like I come from an area that's considered like a colored area in the Western Cape, and what I found is that my community won't necessarily speak up unless it directly affects them, or at very critical moments when like the water's cut off or something happens like that. But other times, like people turn a blind eye, and I'm not really sure why that is. And then for those that are aware, often feel scared because they feel like they're standing in the minority, like it's one or two people. So how, from the speakers here who are in the community and who have been successful in mobilizing people on the ground, like how do you do it? Because there's also instances like in my community where I want to start initiatives and stuff like around waste management and things like that. But I don't know how, because like you have a WhatsApp group, but then nobody like responds on it and stuff. So yeah, just practical ways.
Thank you. I like the session because it links to the session that we had on the other side around energy. And I do work for the government, unfortunately. But from a policy perspective, I think, it's very useful to understand what is happening on the ground. But I also wanted to say that it's also very important to also try and understand what are the issues also happening within the local municipalities. Because also from the session that we had before this one, just to talk about the financial constraints at the municipal level and why, to a certain extent, they're implementing such terrible interventions, and therefore, like maybe partnering with organizations that can really elevate the voice to other stakeholders like National Treasury, people that are really looking at like the distribution of money to municipalities so that they can cater for poor residents. I think it's very important. And then I also wanted to raise the other issue about looking at other ways of providing or partnering with people that look at service delivery, not from, I think the problem is that most of the time we've seen service delivery done by just government, you know, like access to electricity through the grid, but there's also alternatives. Like, what are those alternatives that we can actually leverage for us to be able to have our day-to-day lives? Unfortunately, I'm not a water expert, so I wouldn't know an alternative for water, but yeah, from an energy perspective, I think, yeah, there are different technologies that we can use, yeah.
One more to promote the chicken nuggets. There is that soup. Yeah.
Thank you. This is just a quick comment, really. I'm from LSE, like Babette, and I've been working with Ivan and Faeza on this racial wealth divide thing. And speaking to your point and your point also, talking about hope and maintaining the status quo. What came out in Faeza's youth group, focus groups, and in stuff we're doing in the UK is that veil of hope has really been lifted. Like, a lot of people in the youth group versus the women and the elderly group were literally saying, I don't believe in that anymore. I don't believe in that there's mobility, because they haven't seen it happen in the same way that people that are accessible in those kind of surveys will see, because they do have some kind of vision to see somebody's been able to do it. You know, even though the exception proves the rule, it's really those people in those super marginalized spaces that aren't accessed by public surveying that really have the general population's view on being able to move or not being able to move in a social mobility way. And the idea of a ladder and your idea talking about why people don't want to mobilize, it makes me think of like playing a game of snakes and ladders. There's a ladder there, but the dice are weighted. You're never gonna get it, but it's there. So one in 1,000 may get the lucky dice, but you're not going to. You're more likely to get the snake. But having the ladder there is very necessary to maintain the idea that people don't want to move, because it's better than getting a snake. You might not get a ladder, but if you don't do anything, it's not gonna be better or worse. So because the risk is so much and the threat is so intense, people don't want to move unless it directly affects them. So it's kind of about building solidarity and having also safety where people can move when something doesn't affect them, because people don't have the safety to do that, or the bravery sometimes. Yeah.
Thank you. I just finally want to ask you guys a question about South Africa has a recent and in some ways very powerful democratic system. You know, there was a post-94 settlement that was actually very progressive in many ways, although, you know, contradictory in terms of neoliberalism. But are you still thinking, I mean, for instance, that, you know, there is possibility, some people have talked about the kinds of local solutions that can be raised, but there is possibility for a wealth tax, for progressive taxation, for universal basic income, because all the economists that are here today, many of them have been involved in projections that show that these would be the effective things, you know, but the problem is that these will not happen or cannot happen. You know, is it true that these could all not happen? I mean, it's not that basic income has never happened in any country. People have been trialing it for years and years, showing it works. I'm just wondering what you think about that. Wealth tax, too. It's not an impossibility to impose a wealth tax. I mean, it may be an impossibility to find the wealth. This is what we have found doing this research, that you can't talk to white people. They don't want to talk about it, and you certainly can't talk to very wealthy people. You don't even know who they are. So they are hidden behind shell company after company, you know. So that's one issue, but at least if you can grab onto those ones that you can find, you know, do you think that there is some possibility around the strategies, for instance, that Michael has proposed, or for some kind of parliamentary progress at the same time?
Okay, I'm gonna start by responding to, I think first the local government person that's here, who's probably scared, and you shouldn't be. I think just to say that from a community's perspective, we haven't really had any positive engagements with government, right? Just recently I was in a session where we had officials there, a few officials, and honestly they just stood there and said, This is the issue, there's nothing we can do about it, there's nothing you can do about it. Period. It made me very depressed that day. But I think we need to start looking at how do communities work with local government, because ultimately we need to look at the bigger picture, right? Where the budget is going, and that there's too much expectations from local government. They will always have enemies because they don't have the budget to provide the service or assist even communities. We do have ward councillors that make very stupid decisions, like they have a garden and they spend 1 million or 500,000 on a garden, and the person living opposite the garden has no water. You know, these kind of decisions. So there is reason for people to be very angry, you know, and the ward council is not able to provide what everyone needs in the ward, right? But I think the ward councillors must also be standing up in their positions and saying, hold on, you can't give me all of these responsibilities when I can't, I'm not able to service everyone. So I think people must be, certain positions we have to take with our local government, because I've also seen that national is washing their hands from many of the responsibilities, you know, washing their hands and saying, no, this is not our responsibility, it's local's responsibility, knowing very well that local has no funds whatsoever. Yeah, and then secondly, I think self-organization is key. It's very key, it's important. I understand that people, you know, jump up when the issue affects them. But we have to find ways to convince people that even if you are not affected now, the way it's going, it will affect you. And I think with consciousness comes confidence. You know, we have so many people in our communities, you said it before today, people know exactly what they want. They know exactly what they need. It's often the language, you know. So if you have a focus group with someone about, we can just ask a question about this water and you won't really get answers. But they have a focus group with that same people and they will give you, if it's in their own comfort zone and they feel comfortable to speak with the people in the group, you will hear a lot more about what. So I think a suggestion for your side would be, go and get information in the community. Like, what are the issues, first of all? You know, we decide on issues, but people don't necessarily see it. Someone in that home who doesn't maybe do something around water, who doesn't feel that they're affected by water, but they feel something else, that they are affected by, my child can't go to school because I don't have the resources to send the child, etc., etc. So the first thing I think is to go into the community and find out what are the issues and what are the issues that they want to get organized, because ultimately all our issues are interlinked. You can't even separate it. You can't separate electricity from water, from housing, from education, from health. It's all there in one pot. Just some of it's not working. In fact, at this moment, nothing is working. But in that way, I think, and one thing I think is women. You'll find women, the households, they head the households, they are also always willing to fight for these kind of things. So going out there, find out what the community, and start where they want to start. You know, rather than you coming with a project and saying, I have this project and I want you to get involved. Go and ask people, what do you want to get organized around? That's important, sorry. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
I tend to agree with Faiz, but I think most importantly, I tend to be scared by what I see in the field, that I also tend to talk about things that are scary as well, you know. I think of that statement that says no one is coming, you know. But what that does for me is put me in a practical space, which what we are doing here has allowed us to do as well, you know. Instead of waiting for government, I think there is strength in community and organizations as well. And sometimes we don't know how effective the work is until we see the results. I have two cases where I was doing research. I was just doing research and talking to people. The first time I was talking to women, and what I did for my PhD was that to make sure that when we have interviews with them, when they bring up an issue, we give them resources which they can use to say, you have this issue, use this resource to, you know. The knowledge that those women had was very powerful, because one of them was being abused each and every day and she didn't know where to go. And just giving her that resource helped her to start her own life, right? And we also had the same case when Corinne, we did research on the impact of COVID on people who are living with HIV, right? And we had powerful tools that people could use, you know, Sometimes you feel like it's not making a difference, but it does. Why I'm also saying this is because specifically with the research that I do and the work that I do, I work with a lot of migrants who are undocumented. They don't even know that there are spaces that they can access if they are sick, to get documents, to get support, to get help. So that aspect also limits the organization within which we can engage with, because as soon as we say they are undocumented, right? Arguably, they are the bulk of migrants within South Africa, but they are not recognized. It seems like government and a lot of organizations treat them as if they are not there. They're just blind to their plight or even their existence, right? Which makes a challenge, but also presents an opportunity where you can engage not only with community, but with willing organizations to make sure that they are empowered and they are organizations that provide them with asylums. They are organizations like what Michael was talking about, where they can get documentation, they can get work, to better their lives, but they don't know about these aspects. So that education aspect is also very important, not only in terms of mobilization of resources, but also the impact of the work that we can do in terms of partnering with organizations, willing organizations, and forming communities like this that engage within this conversation and opening up dialogue about these things.
Okay. To organize people is very easy. We first start with home meetings with 8 people, 6 people, and have those discussions. Then you go to a next community. You do the same home meeting before you make it official organization, like we call them chapters now. It's how we do it. We go to those communities, engage with communities, tell communities what's the problems, then they understand. Sometimes we call stakeholders meetings, where you go and present as an organization what you want to try to do in your communities. Stakeholders come, stakeholders will help you actually to spread the word about other communities, so you can work with your community. So you make that connection actually with stakeholders. The other thing that will help you also, you ordinary people who are sitting in the corners, have discussions with them, one-on-one discussions. They will buy in, and they will go and mobilize you people actually who can get involved in your project that you want to do in your community.
Is it even on? Yeah. Prior to going to LSE to study, I worked in the gender-based violence sector in the UK for 15, well, I'm still doing it, so 20 years. And I think in that, it is just what you said, it's about really listening to people. And I also think there's something about letting people know that they're right, because there's something that happens in this sort of a system where you lose confidence in yourself and you start to feel, is this my fault that this is happening to me? And I don't just mean that in the gender-based violence context, I mean that in everything. When you are experiencing structural violence, social harms, but you internalize it, and you start to think that the reason you're not progressing is because of you, and in a way it partly is, because you become damaged by that negative experience, and it's so hard to move forward because of that. And I think that the lady in the beautiful jacket, she said earlier on about how policy, how people go and, they want to read a policy document and then for regular people to comment on their policy document. And that happened a lot at one of the institutions that I worked in. I was expected to summarize a 40-page document to women that were living in a refuge in one room with their 4 children, and then say, what do you think about this policy? Why would they care? It's just, we have to think about what does participation really mean? And if you're doing it in a total waste of time way, then like, why are you doing it? There's so many things in that sort of workspace are just a waste of time, and we have to start naming them as a waste of time. When you work within those institutions, you have to start saying, well, why are we really doing that? Is that really going to help? Because sometimes people stay silent. I've seen it, and we just let money get wasted. So I think that that's something to think about. And the last thing I'll say is, I think intersectionality is a buzzword now, and yeah, it really does matter, all of the different things about us. But I think that sometimes what keeps getting hidden is what's the same about all of us in our experience. And there needs to be a greater level of solidarity across difference. We need to start highlighting more the things that people are experiencing across difference, because we can't, in our separate groups, we're not powerful enough. But I think there needs to be, you know, like that period of Afro-Asia solidarities, or, you know, globally and locally, we need to think more about what makes us the same and how we're actually trying to meet similar goals. And this project is part of that.
Can I say the last thing, please? The other thing also, let people speak their language. Don't come there with a presentation in English. Let them speak the language, have somebody who will translate, and so people can understand why they will go with you. Because if people are not to understand, you will never see them the next day, because you have spoken a foreign language.
I think we've gone over time, but this has been really wonderful discussion, I think. Thank you so much to everybody for all your efforts and your solidarities in between yourselves. Thank you.